Just can't please get one taunt. These mobs are hitting me.
I'm sorry, I only have one taunt and there's 30 mobs hitting you.
Well, something that may not happen anymore is melee may still rip threat. However, dying to Fervent Strikes seems like it will not be happening as much to some mobs, maybe. Basically yesterday there was a change to, quote, Fervent Strike mechanics, which are basically just a colloquial name for anti-kites. And these are just mobs that will end up hitting the nearest melee target to them whenever a tank is not in range. So some of the stuff that got changed was Beak Slice, Haymaker, and Shield Bash.
Yeah, so they've increased the range on these effects in some cases, or in some cases actually reduced them. But they've kind of standardized these range to 10-yard range. So if the tank is kiting a little bit, these are still going to hit them. Like if the tank is trying to just dodge autos, it's still going to hit the tank. But they are not going to target the closest melee if the tank is out of range. They're just going to, I guess, stay queued up and then cast once the tank gets back in range.
And that's actually very dangerous. So
yeah, it means that if you walk into it like these Haymaker mobs in Solia's Gambit, right? You run away from that pack. If you come back in and 3 of those mobs cast Haymaker at the same time on you, that is tremendous pain. But it's predictable, right? And
exactly.
I don't hate it being that way. But yeah, the Fervent Strike history is definitely an interesting one because they sort of are all over the place, and they kind of have been for a while. Like if you look here at these unannounced hotfixes, these Return to Karazhan effects are also Fervent Strikes, right? But we didn't really notice them as much in Legion. We didn't really think about these mechanics as being fervents because generally the pack was like AoE crowd controlled, and then it was kited with no melee in the high end groups, right? And there were only a couple of places where melee had to really ever worry about being killed by a fervent, right?
There was definitely some that had fervents, but a lot of the dungeons just generally did not have fervents, and that's what we're going to talk about in a little bit. There's still actually some possible fervent strikes in a lot of the Shadowlands dungeons. I saw a list, and there was like 20 other fervent strikes on it. So while these couple have gotten hit, I think that I would expect some more to be coming down the pipeline with potential other fervent strikes.
I don't know. I mean, does there need to be 0 fervent strikes?
Okay.
I actually don't. I think fervent mechanics. So again, the Fervent Strike mechanic where it's like if your tank is out of melee range, this is going to punch somebody else. I actually don't think it's awful to have some of that, but I do think that like 25 over all of these dungeons is probably wrong. It should be more like 3 or something. Like very specific mobs that have a Fervent Strike that are like deadly, and if you kite them, they're going to do that to you.
I think that this is actually pretty reasonable to remove the Beak Slice from the Matriarch specifically. Or in the Blade Beaks, because these are some of the only mobs that you actually group up in kite, and so them having the anti-kite on them is so obnoxious.
Yeah, it's interesting as well because obviously like kiting was the big strategy back in Legion, right? Like any high end team would be doing kiting as pretty much their whole plan in a lot of these dungeons. Now this Neltharion Slayer pull, this wasn't even about Fervent Strikes, right? This was like, oh, these will cast Avalanche. And
this had a
Jagged Disc.
This actually had a Fervent Strike in it. That Nasher that you see right on the screen.
Okay.
It actually did have the Stone Gaze was nearest target. So
interesting.
It was an interrupt. It was a little bit different, but it did have a Fervent Strike style mechanic. There's also a bite that was from the Nasher as well, which you would use like rogue parry at the time to bait.
Right. Yeah, so in Legion, even though there were fervents, the kiting, they weren't such that you couldn't kite, right? A lot of that was because melee wasn't very popular, and the melee that did exist were rogues that could evasion or parry it or whatever. Yeah. And then, the tank threat was just phenomenal, that expansion, right? Like, tank threat was 4 or 5 times better than it is right now, and you wouldn't lose threat running away from these mobs as long as you went in with, like, a couple Belfs and AoE stuns, back when Belf, of course, was the AoE interrupt. And
right here. He's that blue marker. Look at how
exactly.
These mobs
didn't have any trouble holding threat on this whole pull for the duration. Now, obviously, they have an MD in this group as well, but still, it was like this is not an issue, right? There's one mob that has gained threat on Gingy there, and then feign death. Problem solved. So, it was a very different strategy, and I think it's one that Blizzard didn't really like.
I agree.
So they came in BFA and they nuked tank threat into the ground, and they added several deadly Fervent Strike mechanics to the dungeons, which Atal'Dazar, of course, that's where the word Fervent Strike comes from, right? It was the honor guard and the living side of Atal'Dazar that did Fervent Strike.
The biggest change, and one of the biggest changes that we're still feeling the effects of even to this day, is this threat change that you alluded to. So basically, whenever out of Legion, the artifact weapon had a threat modifier on it, and so the tanks generated 10 times more threat than DPS. And then going into BFA, it got nerfed to where tanks only generate 4 times more threat than DPS. And this was an absolutely crazy change. And basically since then, I think that tanks have been complaining very actively about threat in dungeons. And obviously it's to counteract things like this, like that Nelth layer pull that we just saw. But we've been seeing it. They added this threat modifier, negative threat modifier that I just talked about, and then they added in a lot of these fervent strikes, like you just brought up. And looking even in a Taldazar, where the namesake comes from, these honor guards are ferventing, and it's basically one of these things that everybody is in melee. It's for a couple of reasons, but there were so many times that a tank would step. If the tank in this group actually steps to like the edge of this life bloom, the nearest target is getting fervent. And that's how a lot of the anti-kites are, is that it is an 8-yard range, but it is very deadly, and a lot of mobs will end up just immediately one-shotting melee. And it feels like there is not a ton of room for counterplay when that happen.
Yeah, it is definitely a mechanic where, like, especially if you're unfamiliar with the dungeons, it feels pretty unfair, and it really penalizes the melee that don't have, like, I mean, like, for me, this expansion playing as a rogue, this expansion, like back in BFA, I was doing a lot of, knowing it was coming and parrying or vanishing as the cast started on me, those sorts of things. And like, that was really fun and cool. But, you imagine being somebody that doesn't know all the intricacies of how the fervents works. And it's like such a big barrier to entry. Yeah.
And so players started having a lot of issues with threat in season like 3 and 4. And that's when they gave a threat modifier to the Heart of Azeroth. And so basically Blizzard has buffed threat. It's got to be at least 3 or 4 times at this point since the original.
I mean, they literally just did it most recently in 925
as well. Right here.
Yeah,
look at this.
They gave us a 18% buff, and they said that the reasoning was that tanks shouldn't be losing threat if they're in melee hitting stuff. Right? That was their language basically, which. Obviously, like that's the problem, right? With threat is they tried to make it so that tanks couldn't kite and keep threat, but they've accidentally landed where tanks can't stay in and keep threat if they're with certain DPS specs that do a lot of damage. And it's there's ways to play around it. The best ways are like, okay, I guess we're not inviting this Fury Warrior, right? We're gonna, and I think that's a pretty unfortunate best answer to threat. So I'm glad that they're looking at this. I do think, though, that like the philosophy they stated of let's make it so tanks hold threat while they're in melee and lose threat if they're kiting, like rather than trying to fix this with a number buff on threat, like maybe they actually got to go back in and do something creative to do exactly that, like tank threat multiplier increased as long as they're in melee range or something, right? Give them double threat while they're in melee, and then have that fall off over 20 yards as they are farther away. Those kinds of things I think would be a good way to make it so that we don't return to you're able to kite after the first 5 seconds of the pull and keep threat forever, but you keep threat against the Fury Warrior, which...
So just the general timeline is like, this was happening in Legion. Blizzard was like, no, that's not happening. They nerf tank. They actually hotfix nerf tank threat by a massive amount. They cut it over over a 50% nerf on this. And then in addition to that, they added a ton of anti-kite mechanics in BFA, which continued into Shadowlands, and then they also made a lot more mobs have a lot more spell casts in BFA, which has been cut back a decent bit in Shadowlands. To Blizzard's credit, they definitely cut back a decent number on the mobs that require multiple interrupt rotations, where you're able to.
There's still a few of them, but I mean, there's a lot of mobs that do important stuff, but a lot of them aren't kicks anymore. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's a little bit less kick intensive than it was. Like if you're looking at any of these pulls and like you see the interrupt tracker, just like always, nice little drink there. Yeah. This was commentary. This is a commentary video. Okay, I wasn't doing that in the middle of the key. But have some respect
on the pulls here. They're even doing. They have like multiple interpretations. There's also fervents on top of this, and then there are mobs that your tank doesn't necessarily want to even be in melee of the whole entire time. And so the Blizzard certainly overcorrected themselves and left themselves in a spot where tanks can't maintain threat. And so now we're finally starting to see Blizzard, I think, understanding on a philosophical level why this is less fun for the player base just as a whole. And that comes in the form of they buffed threat gen They buffed threat gen again, which I've heard from tanks. I'm not 100% sure. It's still not great, but it's not.
Obviously, 18% is better than nothing, but yeah, it's tough because
Yeah.
generally later in the expansion, tank damage is scaling slower than DPS damage, right? So
Hmm.
even potentially less than their threat multiplier relative to the DPS, and that can make things really. It can mean that just the gear nerfs your threat effectively every patch.
Imagine being a bear druid, man. Like, they obviously got their 4-set pretty nerfed, and they're the lowest damage tank right now. Imagine being a guardian druid in a key. Like, you're not going to be able to keep threat off of most classes, I think, right now without insane coordination, a bunch of MDs and stuff like that, and it's tough. But I think that the most important thing is I hope that this is a change in philosophy on Blizzard's end, understanding when fervent strikes are appropriate versus not, maybe understanding like when interrupt rotations are appropriate versus not, and allowing tanks to be able to maintain threat in Mythic Plus dungeons in a healthy way. Because I don't think that I don't disagree. This is like a bit absurd. Like just looking at this poll, how they're dealing with it, they're basically negating. So for context, the Pelter it has like a throw. It's like a shoot mechanic, and it's like just a typical archer, except it throws rocks. However, whenever your tank's on a melee range, it doesn't do anything. That's not healthy. Like obviously the mob shouldn't be designed like that. The Nasher, like the way it was designed as well, is it only like does its cast if somebody is within melee range. So you had groups like Dratnos mentioned earlier, only running all range DPS. Again, that's not healthy. But there are ways that you implement these things that aren't the Shadowlands and BFA ways that we got these, where it was a bit egregious in regards to like what the fervents were doing, what the anti-kites just in general were up to, and then the tank threat. It's just felt pretty bad, I would say. But I do hope that Blizzard understands that now.
Yeah, I think going into Dragonflight, like I wouldn't mind if there were a few mechanics that did anti-kite in the way that Fervent Strike did, but maybe make them longer cast times and like pretty
Okay.
big telegraphed animations, and let people know that it's coming, and that you can and make them like stunnable and stuff as well, so that there's ways around it if you do run into one while you're kiting. Maybe they could make more mechanics that like, okay, if you run away from this mob, it's going to grip you back in, right? Like, and that's going to happen or something like that, right? Like if they want to come up with some creative ways to make some pulls not let you kite, I'm here for it. But the real problem with the fervent strikes has been that it's a huge answer to them is literally just like, okay, your melee are standing out of range of this as well for the duration of the kite, and like that is pretty unfortunate. And the other big problem with fervent strikes, I think, that is really underrated is like if you're somebody who's just starting to push keys and you've like got all your 15s timed and you're like, okay, let's go do this 17, and like you just get one shot by one of these fervent strikes, that's like you're just like, what happened to me? Why is this happening? So I think that they represent a lot of the kind of most unfair feeling deaths that you can have when you're just getting started, potentially pushing Mythic Plus keys. And I think it's something that keeps a lot of people from going further with that.
People were clowning Blizzard a bit for calling it fixed an issue, and then
Yeah.
we're talking about the beak slice and stuff like that. I mean, it is an issue. Like, if people were clowning them a bit, but I think it was an
does.
issue
Yeah,
that needed to
their
be
language
fixed.
suggested it was a bug, which like clearly these are how they were designed and operated for 2 years, right? So,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I don't like to nitpick too much about language except for fun. Um,
I'm down for these to be changed if it's
what do you think about the perspective that like, okay, hey, we've had these dungeons for a year and a half. They're going to be in the pool for another 3 months or however long until season 4, right? Why are they getting all these changes now versus, like, isn't this kind of like the worst possible time? Like, I mean, obviously it's better than nothing, but it's right at the end of these dungeons life
okay.
cycle, right?
I agree. It's not exactly the most timely of change. I would have preferred this 10 months ago. But like at the same point, I'm not necessarily going to nitpick things like positive changes that improve players' gameplay experience that are coming at the end of the expansion, even though it is the end of the cycle for a lot of these dungeons. I think that for me, it more is more indicative of like a paradigm shift, how they're viewing anti-kites just as a whole, and they're looking at like what mobs are doing them, how they like the verbiage that they're using, and then they're changing them on like a fundamental level. Because like you said, they're changing some of them from 8 to 10 yards. The cast time, at least on this Haymaker, changed from 0.75 seconds to 1.5 seconds. So you're very, it's a lot easier to telegraph the mechanic and things like that. And I think that if they also go into the dungeons and just create fewer of them, it would probably be in the player's best interests. And so it's weird that it's coming. I think that the time that it's coming at is strange. I'm not going to complain about positive changes, even if the time that it's coming at is weird. You could definitely say, "Oh, why not sooner?" But you gotta.
I actually think that it makes a lot of sense within a season to start doing these sorts of changes like this late in a season, but obviously like earlier in the expansion, right? Doing this in season 1 would have been better, but I like the optimistic perspective of like, well, maybe this is the new normal, right? Maybe we are going to see M plus that's more carefully cultivated. I also think it's nice. I think something people are forgetting is like Blizzard's clearly moving in this direction of dungeons being a little bit more evergreen. So it's not like we're never going to see Mists again, right? Like it's Mists is good. In 12.3, Mists is in the dungeon rotation, I've heard. So it's good that they go in and have these dungeons cleaned up because they are going to be rotating back in at some point potentially.
Yeah, I mean, like in BFA, like they hit the Mechagon ones, like this headbutt and this shield bash whenever Junkyard was current. These mobs were so obnoxious, and you would just like have people randomly die to the piston head mechanic. You'd have people randomly die to the bully if the tank was just barely out of range of the bully. I know so many people who lost shock bots to the headbutt, and so I think that it's good that they're looking even at the legacy dungeons, the evergreen dungeons, like you're talking about, and making the changes to them. And so that's actually a really good point. Not something that I really consider.
Yeah, either way, I think this is a good another step in a good direction, and yeah, I'm glad to see it. Hopefully, they do clean up more of the fervents that are in Shadowlands. Although, again, if they leave a few and those ones are intentional, I'm down for it as well. But getting rid of most of them sounds great.
Fervents can be healthy. Overuse of fervents really annoying.
They are part of a balanced diet, but not at the ratios that they've been here.
The headbutt on the bully just didn't make sense because it was around a bunch of mobs that would just fixate too, and it's just like the tank is like trying to get threat on like random mobs, deal with like the fixated stuff, and then somebody would accidentally get headbutt, and you're like, okay.
Do you remember the freehold? One of the other anti-kite mechanics they did was the freehold throw that dropped, like it threw your tank and then it dropped threat on them. Do you remember that one?
Yes. In addition to that, the necrotic wake. The first mobs in necrotic wake, whenever they would leap out, they would drop threat too for a long time. And so, I mean, Blizzard ended up changing this eventually. Those mobs off limits. No more of this drop threat shenanigans. No more of that, please. I beg.
Yeah, but I think overall, we can get somewhere. Like I'm not saying we have to get back to kiting working. I just think I'm glad they're looking into a healthier way of avoiding this Neltharian's Lair type play.
This is sick whenever you do it.
They actually, I mean, they found a way for this even in Nelth's Lair, right? They've increased the jagged disc range to like 60 yards, right? So you'd have to be even farther to make this kite work, and obviously threat's worse too. So even this dungeon, when we go back today, it's you can't really do this.
Exactly. I mean, they changed it.
Anyways, we're getting a little bit off the old topic.
Anyways,
I think we had a good discussion about the fervents and the anti-kites. What do you think? Let us know in the comments, please.
Goodbye.
Please comment. One comment, please. My algorithm.
All right. GG's.